Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Jean Leroux. I'm a research associate with the DFR Lab Sub-Saharan African Research Unit. And I'm excited this evening to be hosting a panel on disinformation for hire, as my colleague Ayush graciously led us into this evening. Now, my personal journey into open source investigations was prompted by the activities of the now defunct British PR firm Bell Pottinger. Bell Pottinger used disinformation to weaponize racial tensions and the socioeconomic disparities here in South Africa in order to launder the reputation of the politically connected Gupta family and their businesses. But this was only part of a trend seen in recent years, where there's an increasing role that the for-profit companies are playing in conducting disinformation campaigns. And while companies have been contracted by governments to engage in propaganda for decades, we're now seeing these PR and political communication firms developing expertise in providing disinformation as a service for politicians, corporations, and the governments in which they operate. From PR firms in Egypt, trolls for hire in the Philippines, and the dodgy electioneering in Africa, our guests this evening will be taking us through the way these operations work, how researchers pick them apart, and what selling this BS actually means for democracies. I'm joined in no particular order by David Agranovich, who's the Director for Global Threat Disruption at Facebook, Dr. Emma Briant, who's an Associate Researcher at Bard College, Patricia Campos Mello, who's a reporter at large and columnist for Folha de Paulo, and Jonathan Corpus, who's an Associate Professor with the Global Digital Media at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. So I think without opening it up for introductory remarks, we're going to be jumping straight into the questions. For the audience as well, if you guys do have questions, please make use of the Q&A function in the Socio app. We've got a team standing by to pass them along through to the panel. Jonathan, if I can put you on the spot, maybe you can take us through. You've done a lot of research about the way that these for-hire troll farms operate, specifically in the Philippines.
Yeah.
What does one of these operations look like, and how does that fit into what are the different parts that make up a for-profit troll operation like this?
Yeah, for sure. And my research really takes like a worker-centered approach to understanding disinformation for hire. I think the story of the Philippines is known by many as one in which the country is known as a content moderation capital of the world. So a lot of Facebook and Twitter's content moderation are outsourced to precarious workers in the country. And I was trying to kind of like round that story side by side, the proliferation of troll farms. So on one hand, you have these content moderators in very precarious work situations. And at the same time, like these fake news production is very much normalized within the country. And in my work, I try to interview campaigners, so those enlisted by politicians for national campaigns, but also local campaigns. And I was really able to uncover like a whole hierarchy of workers. So you've got advertising and PR consultants working directly with politicians, and they often kind of work as an intermediary to also kind of shield the politicians from actually having to deal with the influencers, fake account operators who are producing those memes, who are also stoking class tensions, also producing misogynist speech to attack and smear their rival candidates, and also to promote them. And so the story here is one about complicity of a whole range of workers.
Right, so you mentioned that there's this hierarchy and there's different layers in this organization. This sounds a lot more organized than, if you talk about a troll or a troll factory, the immediate impression is, a guy sitting in his basement behind his computer and he's just typing away at the keyboard. But this obviously sounds a lot more organized. How would some of these people describe their working environments?
Yeah, for sure. So I was also trying to differentiate the Philippines context and many Southeast Asian countries where the political system is not so ideologically differentiated as it is in the US or the UK, for example. So the troll living in their parents' basement might really be believing in a lot of these far right messages that they are producing, right? But for many of these workers, those at the lower level of the hierarchy, they're doing it for the money. They're doing it for their family to, just to make a living. And of course, creative industries have been embraced in the country as a sunshine industry. It's seen as a way to entice more people into, you don't have to leave for overseas to become overseas workers. You can just stay at home in these kinds of creative industries. But what I'm trying to argue in my research is that there's many ways in which troll work is kind of lent an aura of professional respectability. So these people are given titles, official titles of like community manager, social media operator, consultant, strategist, but really they're being asked to do fake accounts, attack memes, attack ads. And so, the story here is about also moral justifications, right? And how do they justify this kind of work? How do these people sleep at night? That's what really interests me in the whole disinformation for hire discussion that we're having today.
I mean, you've spoken about this food chain almost. You've got these workers motivated by financial means and the prestige of the positions, all the way at the bottom. But right at the other end, all the way back to the top, you've got the clients, the PR firms and their clients, the ones who contract these services. Now, Emma, coming over to you, you've done a lot of research yourself on the way that PR firms and specifically the parent company of Cambridge Analytica, SEL, the way they've influenced elections, not just recently, but going back years and years.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this kind of motivational side of it, what drives the people behind it, is something that also fascinated me and is one of the reasons why I went into studying this. And not just these kind of bad actors who are doing disinformation campaigns, but also people who work for Western governments in the area of counterterrorism and, influence operations that are, seeking to counter the enemy of propaganda and so on. I find the whole thing quite interesting. And one of the things I also find fascinating is this kind of laundering of the reputation and the kind of ways in which these firms that sell this as a business actually sell themselves in a way that is completely opposite to what the reality is. So SCL, the parent company of Cambridge Analytica, for years they were operating out of a little tin shed basically in the East End of London that it had like a metal door that would go up like this, and these people had a just complete mess of cardboard boxes and security, that like the padlocks that didn't work and things like this, and just shambolic, virtually nobody working there. But at the same time they would hire people who make actual Hollywood movies and so on to do fancy videos during the defense show and to make themselves look like this big multinational company. Now, years later, of course, they managed to promote themselves to the extent that they were getting big contracts and had moved into the fancy address in London. They had the postcode to match the look. But, the way that they manipulated the credibility from their defense work and the credibility that they would court with pulling academics in to develop their methodologies, this was obviously a big part of how this company then went around the world selling what it did in more unethical contexts. So I think one of the things I wanted to highlight is actually academics' complicit role in this to some degree, because people often would be wanting to do this for the right reasons, if you see what I mean. So there are very good arguments as to why someone might wish to try to stop terrorists recruiting people and so on, and to persuade people not to join ISIS. But these kinds of methodologies, you don't know how that's necessarily going to be, repurposed. And, that might be in influence operations targeting other academics. It could be, used in elections that are for voter suppression. And, these kinds of people didn't necessarily always know what was being done with the tools. Also, people working in these companies didn't always know what other people in the companies are doing. So, for example, there are folks from Cambridge Analytica who I interviewed who had absolutely no idea that Facebook data was being abused non-consensually. So it just kind of depended on what they were focused on. And, the business of these kinds of firms can also get people into a heck of a lot of trouble who are actually working in an industry that's very opaque. So for instance, the fallout from this, there may well have been some people who are just, joined a company that they thought was just a normal kind of company that's perfectly legitimately, operating and so on. And, that then has a follow-on effect on their career beyond that, because that company was not, acting ethically. Also, sometimes these campaigns can put people in danger if they're not being operated properly on the other side of the world. When you're dealing in a situation where you're putting out fake news in a way that incites ethnic divisions, and the people who are actually running that campaign in that country may be quite identifiable, and come under attack. So there's all sorts of different, I think, consequences in terms of the economy of this, and how different actors, have different responsibilities and complicity in the whole kind of network of production of the disinformation campaigns.
So, I mean, that's probably one of the biggest risks that you face with these things. This operationalization of disinformation, and building up frameworks, and you can almost see, you mentioned now, the low-level workers, the people who, nobody thinks that a troll farm would have a receptionist, for example, sitting in the lobby. But that kind of professionalization and the operationalization of it, that's something that's, it's a major threat. It's something that's making it, harder for us as open source researchers to identify these things. And David, I can imagine for you guys as well, to identify and counter these, professional operations must be, the things you're seeing these days must be a far cry from what you would have seen 2, 3, 5 years ago.
It's an interesting point. In a way, I think it's worth remembering that the people that worked for the Internet Research Agency from the get-go were folks who often had backgrounds from social media marketing or traditional marketing, right? We weren't actually talking about sophisticated intelligence officers from Russia. Now, we were in 2016 also dealing with sophisticated intelligence operations, but when we think about the classic troll farm in St. Petersburg, it has its roots in marketing and PR. And so in a way, I think what we've seen is perhaps a growth of the disinfo for hire space, of professionalized PR agencies offering these types of services over the past several years. But I do believe that the roots of that type of activity have always existed, concurrent with the more sophisticated operations we would see from nation state actors. That's not to say that it's made it necessarily harder to find them or harder to do something about them. I think that the threat report that our team put out recently, and a lot of the research that the other folks on this panel have done, show that it is definitely possible to identify these operations. We have tools both on the platform side and in the academic research space to uncover their activities. I think where we are lacking is the ability to change both the incentives and the deterrence around this particular type of business model. And so just to maybe say a couple of things on that point, on the Facebook side, right? When we find a firm like Archimedes Group for example, which was a CIB for hire, as we would call it, or Disinfo for hire firm based in Israel, or Pragmatico, which was a PR agency in Ukraine that was doing this type of activity. We have some enforcement levers, right? We can take those firms down, we can publicize their activity, we can in some cases take legal action against them for their violations of our terms of service. But the ability for us to deter their activity ends at the boundaries of the platform itself, right? And so there is still an ecosystem-based incentive, right? Someone is still hiring them, someone is still paying for their services, and the costs outside of losing some Facebook accounts or being banned from the Facebook platform is otherwise quite low. And so I think an interesting conversation would be, what deterrent levers exist? What legal deterrent levers can we make this, is there self-regulation or regulation of the PR and marketing space that makes these types of tactics or activities more legally risky? Are there normative efforts that we can pursue where the PR and marketing space or the clients that hire them levy some sort of a cost on firms that engage in this type of bad behavior? And are there diplomatic or government-based approaches to some of these challenges? So I think that one of the challenges we have here is there is a business-based incentive for firms like Archimedes or Pragmatico to exist and to offer the services that they offer. And for us to be effective in countering them, there needs to be more than just takedowns on platforms and excellent work like the work that Emma and Jonathan and Patricia do to uncover this activity. But there need to be actual costs on the back end for the firms that engage in this behavior as well.
I mean, and that's kind of the issue at play here, that there's an ecosystem in which this happens. It's not a specific individual that's running this. It's not a specific PR firm that's running it. It's a broader ecosystem. There's a market. There's people that are buying into that market, and all of this plays into literally this ecosystem of disinformation where there's money to be made and there's people willing to pay to get those services. And I think a good example of that, Patricia, if I could shift over to you, is you've even seen some of this being done off of the major social media platforms. It's happening on messaging services and off of the traditional social media networks.
Yes, precisely, John. As David was saying, there are incentives, and inside this ecosystem here in Brazil, for instance, you have the whole industry of bulk messaging services that is widespread. And even though it was banned by electoral legislation 2 years ago, it's still, there's a lot of incentive. I mean, the penalties are very small. There are no sanctions, and it's very easy. There are low barriers to entry. It's not an expensive thing to do. And usually you have these marketing agencies that they offer a range of services coming from, acting inside groups, Facebook groups, or on Twitter, also providing the bulk messaging service, and also scraping people's data so that you can micro-target better the messaging. And this is a problem here in Brazil because we have just enacted privacy legislation, data privacy legislation. So that should be a bit better, but there's still not a lot of enforcement regarding that. So anyone, and it's not that expensive, you can buy like all kinds of information and voter profile, and so that you can target better your messaging, or even really cheap software to scrape some info from Instagram or Facebook. So this is, on the one hand, this is part of the ecosystem. And on the other hand, you have the government actively engaged in having inauthentic accounts, such as those that Facebook banned in July last year, together with the DFR lab. Inside the government, you have a cabinet that is, it's the social media cabinet, but it's really like a communications and an influence operation inside the presidential palace that is not coordinating, but it does have a big influence. And then you have several pseudo news websites, junk news, that are all sort of corroborating the government's theories or narratives. They're being used just to corroborate whatever message they're trying to convey, and are being shared. And these are several that they look like actual news websites, but they're not. So I guess these three things work together: the government with the cabinet, the influence operation cabinet, then several PR agencies that offer these services, be it like fake profiles or likes or bulk messaging or data scraping, and then these fake news websites that are also used.
I think maybe with that, you mentioned about the fake news websites and the way that, I mean, one of the critical things in trying to address this is making sure that, you know, people who are engaged more digitally, people are living more of their lives online. Children are being brought up from a very young age, you know, faced with the dilemmas of, is this real, is this not? They've got an abundance of information, but it's critical for them to be able to you know, determine what is real, what's not. What do I believe and what do I not believe? One of the questions that came through on the chat, and again, just a reminder for everyone: do ask your questions. We are getting them sent through. One of the questions is that you know, we need to teach kids in school some critical thinking and the checking of sources skills. It might be an old hat for veterans, but some of the new people think it's gospel if something online looks slick and fancy. And that's obviously something that PR firms excel at. I think, Emma, if I could shove that one over to you, that hot potato.
Okay. Well, while I always 100% endorse education and critical thinking, I just don't see this as the answer to this problem, because no matter how much time and money and energy we put into teaching people to you know, go and research behind, you know, stories that they see on the internet, not only do people just go on there when they're passing time and not necessarily wanting to go do lots of research behind every article, but also, you know, there is a limit to how much people will be able to find and anticipate how they're being manipulated. And these kinds of firms are expert at trying to, you know, second guess that. And, you know, it generally is only the most obvious propaganda that you're gonna easily find, you know, an ability to look up and, you know, do a little bit of digging will reveal. And I think we need to go further than that. So we've already mentioned about how, you know, like actors are not necessarily being held accountable. And I think that's hugely important. We absolutely need to be focusing on this industry and exposing wrongdoing and nudging it into better behavior. That's something that's going to benefit the industry itself as well. And I would say also that I think, you know, we have to recognize that a lot of the abuses that are happening, I mean, social media platforms, they have their role that they need to take responsibility for. But a lot of abuses are happening before things even get to the platforms. So, for example, with the case of Cambridge Analytica, they were doing experiments on, you know, thousands of Americans where they were targeting people with like real major anxiety issues who are neurotic with fear-driven messaging to try to find the most triggering kind of propaganda that they could target at people, and then uploading the list to Facebook. Well, that's already been done before it even got to Facebook. So how is Facebook going to stop this kind of you know, use of their platform? I think that there has to be, you know, like you know, some kind of requirement that these companies explain better what's being uploaded. Now, you know, there's been some legislation that's proposed to try to make this more illustrative of, you know, demographics and so on of the constituent audiences that are being uploaded to Facebook, but it's not enough, because how do you show if you've managed to get hold of a list of people with mental health conditions, for example, you know, it's very easy to get away with, you know, having a list of white nationalists and not saying that's what it is. So what I would like to do is to think about, like, how can we regulate the companies as well who are working in this area, and what can we ask Facebook to do in order to require declarations that are actually meaningful around this.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point that you make. That level of accountability, as long as it doesn't exist for, I mean, there's obviously a lot of focus on the platforms, on Facebook and on Twitter, because they are seen as the kind of the vectors for these messages to propagate. But I mean, it's very rare that you'll hear about, you know, a PR firm, you know, being taken to task for something that they did. That doesn't make the same kind of headlines as Facebook's threat reports, for example, would make. There's just not that kind of accountability. Jonathan, if you looked at, you know, the ways in which accountability can be, I don't want to say, actually, I want to say enforced on these bad actors, the ones that take, you know, platforms that take the, you know, the social engineering, if you want to call it that, and malign it for their own agendas.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I'd love to add to what Emma said, in that there seems to be a lot of momentum when it comes to platform accountability, but accountability of big business, of creative industries that are complicit, of political consultants and political marketing. I don't think those have been maximized yet. So in the Philippines, I think I've argued before in my writing that it's easier to blame Facebook for the outcomes of elections, surprise electoral outcomes, than actually to hold the masterminds of very dirty campaigns, to hold them into account. And there's a level of invincibility, of political invincibility, that these strategists kind of enjoy, as long as they are victorious in a political campaign. They can get rewarded with official government positions, and therefore, as I have done together with other engaged researchers on the ground, working with like lawyer and election lobby groups, for example, it's hard to combat them in local regulatory challenges. So for instance, we were trying to kind of propose, can we name people who are consultants of politicians? Can politicians kind of list all the advertising and influencers that they hire for campaigns? And sometimes even journalists are reluctant to participate in this, because you think about it, these ad and PR strategists also hold corporate advertising money, right? So they have ways in which they can intimidate the press as well, to participate in investigations. So I would love to hear from other panelists here and our listeners, how can we also develop local reform of creative industries and political advertising, political marketing. I don't think we've advanced in that regard.
I mean, there's some self-regulation in the industry, and the fact that, I mean, Balf Pottinger went through a range of, you know, sanctions and, you know, enforcement steps taken against it. But I mean, it doesn't actually curb this tendency. There isn't a much of a curb in the volumes of these PR campaigns selling off disinformation to the highest bidder. And I think part of that is because of that market. You've got elections coming up. I mean, there's in the political power, there's I mean, there's a lot for individuals and political parties to gain in ascending to government or in keeping that government. And that, I think that will probably one of the things that needs to be regulated is the way that information is shared, how people are classified, and, you know, the almost segmented into these clusters of people that can be manipulated. You know, you can target the neurotic people with these fear-inducing messages because there's the data is there for them. So I think ways in dealing with the data, you know, using it as a way to, you know, for the purpose that it's been collected, you know, for lack of a better phrasing.
I wonder, I'd love to ask though, whether you think blacklists work. Like, would blacklisting work when it comes to either influencers or companies?
I think, David, I think that might be something you could maybe pick up. I mean, you guys have seen some of these
Yeah.
organizations being kicked off the platform and then, try and rear their heads up again.
Yeah, and I'm curious because I know Emma also had some follow-up to Jonathan's question. So I'll kick it back to Emma afterwards. But it's interesting, on one hand, on a micro level, I think sometimes they do, right? So when we found Archimedes, for example, and removed Archimedes Group, the firm essentially dissolved. And there was some action on the Israeli government side to try and do something about Archimedes Group. But it's hard to say whether the people that worked for Archimedes didn't simply just nebulize back into the ecosystem, right? And I imagine if we were to look at several of the takedowns we've done in the Philippines, including the ones we've linked, for example, to Nick Cabanata, whether the people involved in those networks are simply kind of dispersed back into the Disinfo for hire ecosystem. And I think that actually is one of the challenges here. To maybe like take even a US example for that I think is quite illustrative. We have done takedowns in the last year linked to relatively influential political actors in the United States, including a political marketing firm called Rally Forge. The people associated with that operation are still, it seems, in quite good graces from the political marketing perspective. People still hire them, people still use their services, even if the firm has a different name. Now, they don't have a Facebook presence because they got kicked off after we took them down, but they're still out there making money and receiving contracts. And I think that, like, blacklists, what does that actually mean in this sense? Is it being banned from one particular platform? Then I'm not sure how effective they are, aside from necessarily making my day-to-day work a bit easier because we don't have to deal with that firm. But from making the ecosystem cleaner and healthier, I think that this is actually the self-regulation question for the PR and marketing industry is, should you allow these firms to continue to operate? And for the clients that hire them, what, if any, sanction, not necessarily criminal or legal, right? What, if any, sanction even within the market exists for having contracted with a firm to do this on behalf of your business? That question I don't think we've answered well, although I imagine Emma may have some good thoughts on it.
Thank you, David. May I then? I was gonna, respond to what you said about the Bell Pottinger example. People from Bell Pottinger went on and continued working and so on. One of them, Mark Turnbull, ended up involved in the scandal over Cambridge Analytica. Then, Charles Andre and Associates, also background in Bell Pottinger. And, this is one of the companies that, in the last few years has been flagged for not registering when they should have with FARA. So, I would say it's not like these companies dissolve and go and there's, no more issues. Unfortunately, people continue with their careers in new entities, and we're not necessarily very good at tracking it onwards and sort of thinking about, well, what happens after a company collapses? And there is a sense that people want to allow people to have a second chance almost, and so you end up with Alexander Nix becoming involved in a new company where he's working on social media. So I was like, well, this is a little problematic, especially when he's been banned as a director in the UK from running a business. Yes, that has an impact, obviously, but in relation to like onwards careers, like how do we know really what's going on with any of these people who may have been implicated in this, and to what extent should that responsibility for what happened in the different scandals, which it's not just in the US election, it may be, all of the unethical operations that were involved in around the world. It's a lot of different people who would have been involved in those things. To what extent do we track their future careers and continue to blacklist people beyond the death of one company? That's a really good question, because actually some people may well want to turn over a new leaf and do good things and do things in the right way into the future. But we need enough transparency over the industry and to have, our eyes peeled and looking out for this, just in case there are, operations that continue and just morph into a new entity, for instance.
I mean, as an example of that, you mentioned a few of the Bell Partners individuals, and I mean, three of the people working on the South African account just jump shipped and they started up their own UPR firm and they're coasting along happily. The individuals involved, actually, the ones, thinking up the narratives and thinking up the the campaigns and the way that they could weaponize critical societal issues, they're still carrying on. And as you say, it's a difficult question because on the one hand, you'd like to give them the opportunity to turn over a new leaf. But at the same time, that you do feel a bit cheated out of the accountability for those individuals.
And I mean, you're going to pay, to repeat these.
Exactly.
Penalties have to be punitive.
So I think I'm just going to flip over to a few of the questions coming through. There's one here that I found particularly interesting. This one here. So in contrast to the anonymous trolls, do you have any thoughts on tackling the phenomenon of influencers or micro-influencers with an existing following on social media who are being paid by PR or marketing firms to spread disinfo or political messaging without disclosing that they're being paid to do so? So, and then the questioner asks or mentions that there's an example of this happening in Russia. And this caught my eye because I've seen the exact same kind of behavior here in South Africa as well. Where you've got, individuals, they've built up a following of their own, and they are then almost contracted on a campaign by campaign basis to run these kind of political campaigns. I think, Jonathan, you've got some background on the way and the financial motivations for some of these individuals. Well, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. I'm thinking of the most recent US elections, and there were a lot of news articles about the failed Democratic presidential candidacy run of Mike Bloomberg and how he enlisted hundreds of meme pages, which were mixing like positive kind of campaigning, right? So meme accounts that were posting positive messages to promote a candidate. So here we kind of run across the limits of the frame disinformation, right? When we're talking about influence ops of this kind of at this level. So here it's about the gray areas of campaigning. Like, is it ethical to be enlisting hundreds of meme pages, even if it's in a way for positive advertising, positive marketing? I wrote about this in the 2019 elections as well in the Philippines, where parody accounts, so like a fake politician or like a fake account operating as like a government entity, right? And then they are doing things like as if they're jokes, but they're also kind of being used to attack that candidate. And our suspicion is that because of their coordinated behavior, they seem to have been enlisted by a strategist working for a politician. And if you look at the history of that account, that same set of techniques had been used for a corporate brand. And I've criticized that as a way of kind of like, why are we using corporate marketing like ideas of ethics when it comes to political marketing? I think we need to be stricter. We need to be more transparent. We need to hold these accounts and monitor them in a much stricter way. I also saw Patricia wanting to add to the conversation earlier.
Yeah, no, I just meant to say that not only these PR agencies are not being held accountable, but several countries, I can say that Poland and Brazil right now, they are about to enact executive orders or new legislation that actually prohibit internet platforms from moderating and enforcing any kind of anti-glorification of violence or anti-election integrity. Like Brazil right now is about to publish either legislation or an executive order that's basically gonna actually prevent Facebook or other internet platforms from enforcing their own community rules. And we have presidential elections next year. So not only the PR agencies are still providing those services, but they're getting now another level of protection from this legislation, because you will need to have a judicial order before you remove content or you label or you remove a profile. So I guess this is going to get not better, but worse.
I mean, I think this kind of speaks to this broader problem. It's not a Facebook problem. It's not a Twitter problem. It's not a a government or a PR firm problem. It's this entire ecosystem that's built around selling disinformation. People that are eager to buy it for financial motivations or political motivations or whatever the case may be. And at the same time, you've got people who are willing to sell those services. You've got a creative industry that's built around reputations and PR, and I think it's this entire the way that all of this amalgamates into one hell of a big problem for all of us. One of the suggestions in the questions were whether a supply chain accountability process might be something that could work for this. Where I'm thinking something along the lines of where companies that engage the services of the SELs of the world and the Archimedes groups of the world, that they start maybe taking a rap themselves for engaging these firms in the first place. I think we've got about 3.5 minutes left. I think, Patricia, do you have any comments that you'd like to impart before we wrap up the session?
Sorry. Actually,
yeah. Oh, sorry, Patricia, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, actually, I just wanted to add that there's a change also in the regulation environment. Now we have a series of governments that are actually against enforcing or creating rules against influence operations. So it's going to get even more difficult to deal with this huge PR firms. And here in Brazil, I can say that what has been happening is some of them have been sued, not by the government, but by the internet platforms, but they just close down and open under a new name and, go on as usual.
Oh, goodness. David, just quickly for you, I see as an interesting question, whether there's a blacklist of these companies and PR firms that have been banned that's publicly available and publicly accessible.
Yes, is the short answer. So whenever we do a takedown of these companies, we make the takedown public. And so we also name the companies when we can identify them. And so we've, in the examples I've used, like Archimedes, Pragmatica, a variety of different firms, Twin Mark Media in the Philippines, for example, we have made those public. It's an interesting idea to centralize it and something I'll definitely take back because it's a good idea to maybe bring all that into one place. I also wanted to just maybe plus one Patricia's comment that there is an opportunity here for the folks who might be joining the conference from European or US regulatory bodies, right? To think about whether there is a way to create some norms around enabling enforcement against this type of activity, because Europe has already been at the forefront of leading on privacy regulation. There's opportunity for Europe to say, this is what we think is appropriate behavior in the PR and marketing space. This is what we expect platforms to do to moderate bad behavior by those companies. And we want to see that from more places around the world. It would help set an example that right now, unfortunately, I think to Patricia's point, that ground is being lost to countries that, quite frankly, are trying to make it harder to disincentivize this type of behavior. So a big endorsement of trying to make it easier to do this enforcement so that we can try and take these types of companies down.
Emma, just quickly, briefly, a parting remark from you.
Yeah, I wanted to add just that I think also governments have a role to play in perhaps creating an environment that motivates better firms by refusing, for instance, to work with firms that maybe are working in shady campaigns. So we can create like a gold standard for government contracting, for instance, where, like the SCLs of the world are not going to get the government contracts. And there is more declaration happening, to governments, and, they require more transparency over these firms so that they can't get away with, being an unethical actor and still taking taxpayers' money. So there's also other ways that we can incentivize
and enforce that. Awesome stuff. Hey, Jonathan, lastly from you.
Yeah, I'm actually very hopeful about younger people in the industries who are more mindful about ethics in the company. They tend to be very vocal and challenging their leaders in the company who have, in a way, kind of normalized these practices and behaviors. I'm seeing the resistance from them. So when I do engagements within companies, it's the younger people who say, I was actually very uncomfortable that in the last elections, I was assigned to do this. But the older people in the company tend to be, well, that's always been how it's been done. So yeah, I would want to empower young people to be much more vocal here.
Awesome stuff. I think with that, we're going to be wrapping up the panel. David, Jonathan, Patricia, and Emma, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I hope thank you very much for your time, for sharing your experience. And I hope that the viewers themselves also can take away some proper insights from the session. Back over to you, Graham.
I'm going to steal it back. And with that, we bring day 2 of 360 OS to a close. Thank you to all of you who followed along, took part, or asked questions. Today, we dug into an analysis of the world as it is, looking at the lived impact of policy debates around the tech industry, regulation, online violent extremism, geopolitical competition, and conflict.
Tune in tomorrow for another jam-packed day of programming. We'll be starting the day off with remarks from Hong Kong activist and leader Nathan Law, followed by a panel on the evolution of digital citizen movements in Asia. Later in the afternoon, we'll be joined by the leading tech journalist Casey Newton of The Platformer and Shira Frankel of The New York Times for a conversation on their work covering power dynamics in the tech industry. You can visit our website for tomorrow's full agenda.
As always, make sure to follow along and add to the conversation on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook through our DFR Lab handle and using the 360OS hashtag. Stay tuned on our channels for some exciting additions to Friday's programming too. And with that,
we will see you tomorrow.